there's no chance of escape. Next thing you know, cold steel in your face. Your pain and driving fate is in our hands. Deliverance, the pain upon the stroke of our noise. Predatory impulses controlling our minds. You make the sum, we'll end your fucking life.
Ah, death metal.
A push for time. Can you sum it up in a word?
No.
A sound? Spartacus, thank you.
Death metal is the subgenre that I think most normies think of when they think of metal. Growling vocals, lyrics about gore, and music played at an inhuman pace. I take it we're all familiar with Florida Man. Well, Florida Man invented death metal. This particular Florida Man went by the name of Chuck Schuldiner, and I'll give you one guess as to what his band was called. Yep, that's right, Death. Death effectively took the sound of thrash and set out to make it even faster and heavier, and began utilising more guttural vocals. At this point, the music was so heavy that regular singing just didn't sound right anymore. The earliest version of the death growl was done by the band Possessed in their 1985 album Seven Churches. Possessed were also very influential in the sound of death metal as a whole, and in fact on that same album they had a song called Death Metal. And this song, which shared the name of their demo tape, combined with the relative popularity of death in the underground scene, properly cemented the name for this subgenre. Some people argue that the name was purely a result of Possessed, but I think it was a combination of both. The screaming on Seven Churches, combined with the pioneering efforts of Chuck Schuldiner's vocals in Death, and Max Cavalera's black metal influenced vocals in Sepultura, the death growl was gradually developed into what we would recognise today. Before long, the death growl was adopted by their imitators and quickly became the standard for death metal. That's right, the dreaded Cookie Monster voice that turns off so many newcomers first appeared in the 80s. The Florida death metal scene was underground, but undeniably popular by metal standards, and by the time the 90s rolled around, the biggest thrash bands were still finding some success, but in the American metal underground, death metal had almost completely replaced thrash. The way metal history tends to work is that people find heavy music that they like, but after a while they get too used to it and need something heavier to get their fix. It's exactly like spicy food. What did you think I was going to say? The sound of death metal has the essential elements of the aforementioned growls, down-tuned guitars, which involves loosening all the strings to make every note lower, double bass pedals synced with said guitars, and of course, blast beats. A blast beat is a drumming technique where you hit the snare drum and a cymbal really quickly. Black metal had pioneered this technique, but oh boy did those Florida men love some blast beats. Notable Florida death metal bands include Death, obviously, Obituary, Morbid Angel, Deicide, Suffocation, and of course the infamous Cannibal Corpse. Some of these bands get sectioned off as brutal death metal, and I can understand why, as some are definitely heavier than others, and Cannibal Corpse were among the heaviest of the Florida death metal scene. Some death metal bands, especially Death, tried to have some meaningful lyrics and themes beyond senseless violence, but Cannibal Corpse were quick to realise that you don't actually need any of that. They went all in with the gore and made their lyrics as disgusting as humanly possible. If black metal is like a scary, atmospheric horror film, then this style of death metal is like a slasher film. Not particularly scary and very stupid, but gory and fun. It's fair to say that a lot of these bands were very tongue-in-cheek and don't take themselves too seriously. This is precisely why Cannibal Corpse were more than willing to appear in Ace Ventura. The vocalist of Cannibal Corpse, Chris Barnes, managed to develop a growl that ceased to sound human, and it probably would have been remembered as one of the greatest growls of all time had he been able to keep it up. But once he left Cannibal Corpse to be replaced by George Corpsegrinder Fisher and formed the now infamous 6 Feet Under, his vocals grew quite poor to say the least. At this point, Chris Barnes is pretty much the punching bag of the online metal community. And you know what? He certainly isn't helping his case by getting angry at better musicians for using the same song title he did 20 years ago. George Fisher is notable for 2 things. One, he popularised the windmill headbanging technique. This really only works if you have long hair like he does. He's also notable for having the thickest neck in the fucking world.
Damn, boy, he's thick! Boy, that's a thick ass boy! Damn!
And you know what? It probably is at least somewhat related to his constant windmilling. Death metal has been going strong ever since and is particularly popular in Sweden, which had its own death metal scene that ran parallel with Florida's. Some bands from the 80s Swedish scene include Entombed and In Flames, but Sweden never stopped producing death metal when Florida did, and as a result, Sweden has become the country associated with death metal the same way that Norway is associated with black metal. Death metal has many self-explanatory variations, and for such a maligned, noisy subgenre, it's actually very diverse in terms of style, especially progressive death metal, but we'll get to that. Technical death metal is extremely fast, and tends to feature some of the best drumming you'll hear in all music. Technical death metal is a very loose term, and it seems to cover everything from Gojira to cattle decapitation. Melodic death metal adds some proper melody to the riffs, and even though the vocals are still growling, they can have some catchy choruses. Some of the best known melodic death metal bands, all of whom are from Sweden, would be At the Gates, Arch Enemy, who are famous for featuring female vocalists and not paying their fucking photographers, and Amon Amarth. The latter are probably one of the best examples of what melodic death metal is, but people often forget this because they're mainly known as the Viking metal band. Even though there are other Viking metal bands, you can't top Amon Amarth. If you ask me, the biggest missed opportunity in the entire MCU was never using a single one of their tracks in one of the Thor movies. Brutal death metal, or extreme death metal, is just heavier, more excessive death metal. There's also slam metal, which is a slowed down iteration of brutal death metal, with heavy chugging riffs, almost black metal tier production, and a gurgling vocal style. It's about as monotone as extreme vocals get. Slam metal is knowingly silly, and the best way to describe it is that slam is what people who don't know a lot about death metal think death metal sounds like. It's borderline parody. Like, they literally just do grunts and pig squeals. Most of the time they don't even attempt to pronounce the lyrics. They literally just make the lyrics up after recording because you can't tell them that's not what they're saying. Slam metal is infamously even worse than black metal for having utterly incomprehensible band logos. Well-known slam bands include Abominable Putridity, Ingested, and Devourment. I've listed them because they're the only ones whose names I can actually fucking read. At pretty much the same time the Floridian and Swedish death metal scenes were happening, England was at it again with the grindcore scene. Now, most grindcore bands can be categorised as death metal, but not the other way around. Just think of it as a variation of death metal. Grindcore and death metal are very similar, but with a few key differences. For one, grindcore has more of an emphasis on speed, and for another, grindcore vocals are less growling and more screaming and shouting. Grindcore got the core part of its name because they had a bit of a hardcore punk influence. And they got the grind part of their name from, I'm fairly sure it refers to the grinding away the guitar pick that most of the bands did, because grindcore is pretty much the fastest subgenre. The blast beats were even more intense and the songs were ridiculously short. The most famous example of this is You Suffer by Napalm Death, which is barely 1 second long. They actually won a Guinness World Record for world's shortest song, although I'm pretty sure with the number of grindcore bands that exist it's almost certainly been topped by now. It takes more time for the drummer to hit his sticks together than it does to finish the actual song.
Oh, it's an epic, that one.
Now, the Birmingham boys Napalm Death aren't the only notable band from this subgenre. Others include Carcass, whose gimmick was their use of a medical dictionary for writing lyrics, Pig Destroyer, Brutal Truth, Extreme Noise Terror, and the infamous piss take known as Anal Cunt. Anal Cunt were pretty much just trying to be as offensive as they possibly could. They were a lot like a pizza cutter, all edge and no point. Their music is kind of awful, but I would still recommend that you scroll through their Spotify page and just read some of the song titles. If you have a dark sense of humour, you'll have a good time. Before we move on, I'd like to make a wee note about the band Carcass. For one, they did start out as a grindcore band, but their sound evolved to be more general death metal later in their career. In the early days of the grindcore scene, Carcass used gruesome autopsy photos for album covers, along with using a medical dictionary as a thesaurus to write utterly disgusting lyrics. Just about every other grindcore band had very political lyrics, which was partly related to the punk influence, and their politics were often more overt than thrash. Carcass, on the severed hand, really just wrote songs about gore, and inspired the subgenre of gore grind. It's pretty much identical to grindcore, except instead of being about politics, it's about dead bodies. You'd be surprised how many songs you can get out of such a narrow subject matter. Imagine the level of centrism that's required to prefer to write about maggot-ridden corpses than confront any systemic problems. Porno grind follows the same idea. Grindcore, but about porn, I guess? And also, the songs always start with a porn sample rather than a political sample. I don't fucking know. It's a meme subgenre, really. It exists for the meme. And I think that'll do for part 3. Join me for part 4, in which we'll look at groove metal.
Spread that floor out! Open up, Rocket! I wanna see the brave heart in your fucking eye! Oh!
We've looked at some of the extremities of the early 90s, but what about metal that was relatively more mainstream? Well, thrash soon lost its crown to a new beast called groove metal. Groove metal sounds pretty much exactly the way most people would imagine it sounds. Heavy, groovy riffs that you can move to without having an epileptic fit. Most subgenres owe their creation to a variety of bands in a single scene, but groove metal was effectively popularised by pre-existing thrash bands and just one new band, Pantera.
This is called domination!
These Texan boys originally started out as a glam metal band, believe it or not, but as that subgenre began to die out, they got a new vocalist, Phil Anselmo. Now, you know how most metal vocalists practice sounding deep and guttural? Yeah, well, that's just the way Phil speaks, so he was a perfect fit.
And made it do different things.
Guitarist Dimebag Darrell Abbott had a strong blues influence and in turn was driven to write more bluesy riffs that people could actually move to. Their first album in this post-glam iteration of Pantera, Cowboys from Hell, proved to be a great success, and they wound up as one of the support acts for Metallica's colossal show in Moscow in 1991. They continued to release consistently amazing albums all throughout the 90s, but broke up in the early 2000s. Vinnie Paul and Dimebag were brothers, so they formed a new band together called Damage Plan. Infamously and tragically, Dimebag was shot dead on stage at a Damage Plan show in 2004. Supposedly the shooter was a fan of Pantera with severe PTSD. Such an incident was unprecedented in metal, and we haven't seen anything like it since. Vinnie Paul then went on to be the drummer of the band Hell Yeah. He died in 2018 from health complications. Phil Anselmo now spends most of his time being the frontman of Down, and a total arsehole. Now, I really like Pantera, so I find that it's best to just ignore whatever Phil's up to, because he's a bit of a PR nightmare. Rex Brown is alive and well and doing something, I guess. I don't know, he's the bassist, who gives a shit? Pantera's music undoubtedly incorporated thrash, and generally there's a lot of crossover between thrash and groove, but Pantera's music was specifically very groove orientated. Of course, when talking about groove metal, we can't ignore the influence of Metallica, as their most famous song, Enter Sandman, is exactly that. Their self-titled album, known as the Black Album, is a lot slower than their 80s material, but it proved to be a lot more popular and skyrocketed Metallica's fame. They then went on to make their music even more accessible and pretty much ceased to resemble metal altogether, becoming a dad rock band for the rest of the 90s. But after one infamous failed attempt at a comeback, they did eventually return to form. The Black Album's success was a hugely important moment for metal, and naturally many bands followed its example. Having released one of the best thrash metal albums ever in 1990, Megadeth followed up Rust in Peace with a decidedly groovier album by the name of Countdown to Extinction. The 1-2 punch of these thrash titans changing their sound, combined with the almost overnight success of Pantera, set the new standard for popular metal. Even more underground thrash bands like Sepultura adopted the sound. Another good groove metal band that found success in the 90s was Machine Head, whose first album, Burn My Eyes, held the title of the most successful debut for Roadrunner Records until Slipknot came along. Groove metal saw a brief revival in the early 2000s as Lamb of God found some success in playing metal grooves with a very strong southern influence. You could probably play most of their songs on a banjo and it would fit pretty well. Rob Scallon should really get on that. Given the popularity of groove metal, it wasn't long before it spawned variations. Industrial metal took a lot of the same principles but added some electronic elements, creating a more robotic and machine-like sound. Fear Factory are probably the purest example of the subgenre, but you're more likely to have heard of Marilyn Manson, Rob Zombie, and Rammstein. Manson became a big and controversial success by being an edgier Alice Cooper. White Zombie did well for a while, using a lot of horror movie samples and themes in their music, before their frontman went solo and continued the same sort of sound on his own as Rob Zombie. And Rammstein incorporated keyboards and singing in their native tongue of German. It was at this point that the world realised, oh yeah, German is really fucking brutal and fits metal perfectly. These three bands all have one thing in common aside from genre, and that's elaborate stage shows, with Rammstein in particular taking inspiration from theatre, as they grew up on the east side of the Berlin Wall, and that was pretty much their main source of entertainment. Other industrial metal bands worth mentioning are Ministry and 9 Inch Nails. 9 Inch Nails aren't particularly metal focused, they make a wide range of industrial music, which I recently found out is its own music genre in itself outside of metal. But their influence on industrial metal is hugely important, and they did have a very metal aesthetic. Their stuff tends to be more atmospheric. So atmospheric, in fact, that id Software got them to do the soundtrack for Quake in 1996. Speaking of id Software, if you, like many non-metal fans, were blown away by the soundtrack of Doom 2016, then I cannot recommend Fear Factory enough to you. In the 1990s, Fear Factory very much sounded like the soundtracks of the shooters that were coming out around that time, especially Quake 2. Since then, their sound has evolved somewhat, and it quite clearly influenced Mick Gordon. Just listen to this track from their album released 1 year before Doom, because it fits perfectly. If you say you're not a big fan of metal, but you did like the Doom soundtrack, well congratulations, you like Fear Factory. Oh, and don't worry about the vocals, you'll get used to that. One criticism I have to give to industrial metal is that it is the subgenre with the least impressive drumming in all metal. Most metal, especially death metal, has some of the most consistently excellent drumming in all music. But most industrial bands, with the exception of Fear Factory, are content to do the same basic 1-2 rhythm that wouldn't feel out of place in a pop song. Still, industrial metal works perfectly well for shooter soundtracks, and some of the bands are actually quite accessible for newcomers. Then of course we have the infamous variation known as nu metal. This subgenre was created in a horrific lab accident by innocent bands who just wanted to help mankind. Remember Anthrax? Well, thrash wasn't the only label they wore with pride. They also really like reminding you that they're from New York. New York City had a thriving hip-hop scene, of which Anthrax were big fans. In the late 80s they released a joke song called I'm the Man, where they rap intentionally badly over some basic riffs.
That's right, suck my motherfucking dick!
It became a staple of their live shows for a while, and although it was a bit of a goof, it did raise a few eyebrows. Then everything changed when they collaborated with Public Enemy, who re-released their song Bring the Noise with Anthrax providing the backing music for them. And a lot of people started to think that that combination actually sounded pretty good. Then a little band known as Rage Against the Machine came along. Rage Against the Machine are pretty much rap rock. They aren't quite metal, but they are a lot heavier and angrier than most rock music. They combined political lyrics with rapping and groovy guitar riffs. They became insanely successful and influential. So they're socialists, right? But they made money. Lamau got 'em fucking wrecked. Venezuela. Then, as the 90s rolled on... Wait. Did you hear that? No. No. Oh no. No, 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 no. No, stop! Stop! Nu metal incorporated rap and hip hop into groove metal, which naturally most veteran metal fans rejected. It was a cynical little cash grab of a musical style, but it worked. Nu metal became absurdly popular for a while. Linkin Park and Limp Bizkit were particularly fond of incorporating rap into their music. Linkin Park were especially edgy, but Limp Bizkit were just stupid. Even the name Limp Bizkit refers to a game in which men wank over a biscuit and the last one to ejaculate has to eat it. Which is appropriate because their music was absolute wank. But they were so popular that everyone had to eat a bit of that biscuit. I will admit, some of their songs are genuinely, unintentionally hilarious. I do sincerely enjoy their music though, much to my shame. I'm not going to defend their music as being good, but I do like a lot of it. So switch your brain off, embrace the early 2000s cringe and have some fun with them. Nu metal doesn't just refer to rap though. Bands like Korn, Slipknot and Disturbed are also nu metal, despite featuring little to no hip hop elements. Nu metal doesn't just refer to rap, you see. While there were plenty of nu metal bands who were also rap metal bands, think of it like a Venn diagram with Linkin Park and Limp Bizkit right in the middle. Rap metal can refer to any kind of metal with rap in it, including some heavier stuff like Attila. Nu metal really just refers to popular metal from the early 2000s. It was edgy, the songs were very simple, and it generally felt like a very watered down, commodified version of metal. It also popularised the use of 7-string guitars. Korn were known for using a 5-string bass on top of that. Sure, 7-string guitars were nothing new for bands like Fear Factory or Meshuggah, but nu metal brought 7 strings into the mainstream. Nu metal gets its name from it being new at the time and the fans being too dumb to spell. In all honesty, while nu metal may be a crap imitation of the real thing, it's a really good starting point for people who are first getting into metal. So no judgment if that's where you started. It's kind of where I started too. Of course, that sweet scent of mainstream success corrupted the hearts of many already established bands. A good example would be Machine Head, who figured since they were already based around groove, they might as well go to the next logical step. It was bad. It was very bad. Sepultura also picked up 7 strings and adopted the nu metal sound, but actually did something interesting with it. They incorporated Brazilian tribal drums to create an utterly unique sound on their album Roots, which is now probably their most famous album. In my own honest opinion, Roots was the best thing to come out of nu metal. Then you have alternative metal, or alt metal, which is also very groove based, but it's not quite traditional groove metal and it's not quite nu metal. The best known band in this category is System of a Down, who, like all alt metal bands, were categorised as such because they were definitely metal, but nobody knew what the hell to call them specifically. If you ask me, I think we should categorise System of a Down as progressive nu metal, and not just because that name sounds like a contradiction. They have a similar guitar tone to a lot of nu metal bands and their songs are very short. Plus, they managed to get quite a lot of radio success. The prog part comes from their experimental choices with elements of Armenian folk music and whiplash-inducing jumps from cam parts to... They aren't what you might traditionally think of as a prog band, which is why I'm not discussing them in the progressive metal section, but I think you could honestly make a solid argument that they are. And speaking of prog... Now we've reached the last of the primary subgenres, progressive metal. This is easily the vaguest subgenre because it essentially refers to any metal that gets experimental or unconventional. The essential prog metal band, without question, is Dream Theater. When you think of progressive rock, you think of Pink Floyd, and when you think of progressive metal, you should think of Dream Theater in the same way. They released their first album in 1989, but the first one to really get attention was their second album, Images and Words, released in 1992. On top of extremely technical musicianship combined with clean vocals, they have a keyboard player to add a bit more atmosphere and depth to their sound. They're also known for utilising whatever instruments they think are appropriate for any given song. Is a tambourine a metal instrument? Fuck no, but this is prog, bitch! The first thing you'll notice about prog is that the songs are really, really long. But don't let that turn you off, because they actually earn their length. It's not a padded out series of verses and chorus repeats. Progressive metal songs tend to take you on a journey, and if you skip ahead it'll sound like you're listening to a completely different song. Of course, when we talk prog, we have to talk about time signatures. A time signature refers to the number of beats in a bar. Almost every song you've ever heard is in the standard 4/4 time signature. Since prog is all about experimenting, prog bands often like to avoid the 4/4 time signature to create more unconventional rhythms. Even if you don't know anything about music theory, you should check out Dream Theater's song Dance of Eternity, in which the time signature changes 108 times over the course of 8 minutes. Dream Theater are a great example of an all-rounder progressive metal band, incorporating elements of various subgenres, but you can get more specific types of prog. For example, what happens when you decide to make progressive death metal? Well, you get my favourite band of all time, Opeth. While they might not always switch up their time signatures as much as their proggy peers, they are undeniably progressive, because in what other genre can a song switch gears so abruptly?
12 seconds later.
They mix acoustic sections with beautiful melodic singing, with heavy sections and the best death growls you will ever hear. They've taken death metal, but rather than sticking rigidly to the subgenre's tropes, they've allowed it to progress. You get it? As Opeth's career progressed, the prog started to take over, with the addition of a keyboard player. Then, with their album Heritage in 2011, Mikael stopped growling, and now they pretty much make 70s style prog rock. It's good, very good in fact, but it's nothing like what you would come to expect from Opeth. Then again, that's prog for you, it's incredibly unpredictable. Another progressive death metal band is Gojira. These French environmentalists combined incredibly low-tuned guitars with polyrhythmic drumming and songs about the destruction of the planet. They certainly aren't what you might typically think of when you think of hippie music, but this theme is woven into almost every song. Their song Flying Whales, for instance, tells a story about whales being ancient aliens who fly off into space in search of a new home after humans destroy the Earth. It's a powerful song, but it's best known for the memes around it. Still, the environmentalist thing seems to be working out for them since they got to play Glastonbury this year. Prog really can seep its way into any subgenre, even sludge metal. And this brings us to Mastodon. Mastodon's songs don't always reach the 10-minute mark, but their song structure is undeniably progressive. I mean, when a band does a whole concept album about Moby Dick, that's pretty prog if you ask me. In fact, most of Mastodon's albums are concept albums, and if that doesn't earn the prog label, then I don't know what will. Mastodon are a really good band to start with if you want to get into prog metal. Most of their stuff isn't too heavy for newcomers, nor is it too weird for metalheads. Then there's the more modern prog metal bands like Between the Buried and Me, who seem to be what happens when you let a metal band raid a music department. Yes, this song is death jazz. Yes, I just made that up. And yes, it's probably a real thing now. Other prog metal artists of note include Devin Townsend, who's the former frontman of Canadian extreme thrash metal band Strapping Young Lad. In his progressive solo project, he's had the chance to utilise his operatic vocals, something which he never really got to show off in Strapping Young Lad. At this point, dear old Devi is too hard to pin down to any given subgenre other than prog, because with any given song he just does whatever he wants and no one stops him. Then you have the Dillinger Escape Plan. The Dillinger Escape Plan are prog metal simply because nobody knows what the fuck else to call them. They use all sorts of bizarre time signatures and their music is some of the most chaotic stuff you'll ever hear. 43% burnt is what would happen if you turned the abstract concept of anarchy into a song. They're also infamous for their insane live shows involving breathing fire and beating the shit out of their audience on occasion. Then there's Tool, who are best known for being in a perpetual state of not releasing a new album. I would categorise Tool as progressive groove metal. They use down-tuned guitars and clean singing with all sorts of weird time signatures. Tool are one of those exceptionally rare metal bands that are enjoyed by both metalheads and hipsters. Since prog in itself is inherently varied, it hasn't really spawned any specific variations, other than the self-explanatory progressive versions of other subgenres. Apart from one, the subgenre which nobody can agree on whether it's even real, gent. Gent is an onomatopoeia referring to the sound that a palm-muted, down-tuned guitar makes. This subgenre features a lot of time signature variation and guitars with 7 strings at the bare minimum. So, where did this subgenre come from? Well, it's quite a simple story, really. Switzerland created the FOCS-1 atomic clock. A clock so precise that if you were to look at it 30 million years from now, it wouldn't even be 1 second off. Sweden's answer to this was Meshuggah. In the early 90s, Meshuggah were a thrash metal band who for some reason had named themselves after the Yiddish word for crazy. Then in 1995, with the release of Destroy Erase Improve, they created a sound which at the time was entirely unique to them. Now by this point, 7-string guitars were nothing new, and neither was industrial metal. But industrial metal usually incorporated electronic elements to give it a robotic sound. Meshuggah already sounded like machinery, purely from their inhuman rhythms. They quickly gained a reputation in the metal underground and became one of the heaviest prog metal bands of all time. Chaosphere was their follow-up in 1998, continuing with the sound that they had established, and their lyrics continued to frequently be about cybernetics and machinery. Having already established their sound, they really made a name for themselves in 2002 with the release of nothing. Hold on, that can't be right. Oh, that's the name of the album! This album was a big deal because this was when they moved up to 8 strings for the first time, and Gent was truly born. They also established another trope of Gent, the use of polyrhythms in the drums. In simple terms, a polyrhythm is when 2 separate rhythms are played at once. Believe it or not, this approach comes from jazz of all things. The way polyrhythms tend to work with Meshuggah is that their drummer, Thomas Hake, typically plays a different rhythm with his feet on the bass drums than he does with his arms on all the other drums.
And on top, he's playing like 8th notes with the backbeat on 3. So everybody's head is moving to that, like, ga, 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 ga. I can't even do it, right? But underneath his feet are going like the whole fucking song, basically.
A lot of Meshuggah's songs sound like they've buggered up the timing when you first listen to them because the rhythm is so unconventional. But rest assured, the timing is mathematically precise. Catch 33 got particularly proggy by having every track on the album be part of the same song, but it was their album Obscene in 2008 when the band really made a name for themselves. Even if you're not into metal, there's a good chance you've heard Bleed. They even put it in a Brewdog advert, for fuck's sake. And with this, their notoriety soared, and in turn, the imitators started to spring up. Now these imitators aren't complete knockoffs, and over time they've each developed their own styles, but they all share tropes and motifs pioneered by Meshuggah. Periphery are very much on the technical side, mixing clean vocals with growls. They're also one of the only gent bands I know that use blast beats. Animals as leaders are very experimental and only play instrumentals. Their music isn't always metal, but their guitars do have an undeniably gent sound at times. Animals as leaders are probably the only exception to gent bands that are inspired by Meshuggah, because I think the only reason they use as many strings as they do is just to make it more difficult for themselves. They are seriously excellent musicians. They only really fit in with the metal scene because they don't fit in anywhere else. Tesseract use exclusively clean vocals and riffs which are so absurdly precisely timed that they are jokingly referred to as math metal. Then you have Amur, who are basically what would happen if you gave Limp Bizkit 8 strings. They make genty noises, but their riffs are too simple for this oddly specific subgenre. They're much closer to deathcore, but they sometimes get confused for gent because of their use of 8 strings, so I thought I should clarify that here. Just because the guitar has a lot of strings, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a gent band. Gent usually requires some degree of technical skill, and it typically goes hand in hand with prog. Several gent bands have had the tendency to disappear up their own collective arse from time to time, but overall, I'm still a fan. Although I don't think anyone is going to top Meshuggah. But if I had to recommend a gent band other than Meshuggah, I would probably go with Monuments. And I promise, it's because they're genuinely good. It's not just because they let KMAC 2021 play a solo at one of their shows. But that certainly helps. And with that, I think we'll wrap up part 4. Join me for part 5, in which we'll look at metalcore, deathcore, and some of the more self-explanatory subgenres. Now, the rest of the subgenres are fairly self-explanatory. Folk metal utilises folk instruments and folk musical motifs and tends towards paganism instead of Satanism. Symphonic metal adds symphonic instruments, obviously, and has a very dramatic feel. You might have heard of Nightwish, that's what they are. You can also get heavier variants like symphonic death metal, and if that sounds like your cup of tea, I would recommend Flesh God Apocalypse. Then there's blues metal, which has a very bluesy sound to the riffs, Both Motorhead and Pantera frequently dabbled in blues metal fretwork. Neoclassical metal is metal with a strong focus on musicianship, and songwriting with similarities to classical music. The best known artist in this subgenre is Swedish guitar god Yngwie Malmsteen. Yeah, good luck spelling that. And so that leaves us with just one more subgenre which isn't quite so obvious and doesn't neatly fit under one of the primary subgenres I outlined earlier: metalcore. The name metalcore derives from the fact that this subgenre blends elements of hardcore punk with elements of various metal subgenres. Metalcore is a strange combination. Working with my theory of primary subgenres, it takes a little bit of everything. It typically uses 7 strings, combines screams and growls with clean sections, and has melodic guitar harmonies. A common metalcore motif is, instead of the constant tremolo riffs of thrash metal or death metal, metalcore bands often play riffs with a sort of broken up sound. Small pauses are used to add emphasis. It's kind of hard to explain, but here's an example. Notable bands include Killswitch Engage, Trivium, Bullet for My Valentine, and Avenged Sevenfold. A7X, as they're sometimes known, really made a name for themselves when they put a greater emphasis on their melodic elements on their 2005 album City of Evil. Their soaring popularity from this point soured the metal elitist view of metalcore, but I'll admit that a lot of their songs are actually pretty catchy. In a similar way that some industrial metal artists occasionally attracted goth kids, for a good while in the early 2000s, metalcore was the subgenre for emo kids. Since metalcore was really the last time in recent memory that metal came close to mainstream success, it has unfortunately resulted in the conflation of metal fans with emo kids, which is a misconception that is still very much alive and well in the sad depths of Facebook comments. The large emo following that metalcore has, combined with the fact that metalcore involves a lot of screaming and growling, is partly where the term screamo comes from. Now, fair enough, use it for edgy emo metalcore bands, but you cannot, and I cannot emphasize this enough, you cannot start calling every band that uses harsh vocals screamo. You imbecile, you fucking moron. If you call a death metal band screamo, I will come to your house and tear off each of your toenails individually. You fucking moron, you dipshit, you waste of human resources. The subgenre has evolved somewhat since then, incorporating electronic elements and a bit of pop, and as a result, what little interest I had in the first place is now entirely gone. I do like Architects though, they're very good. Metalcore was the big subgenre of the 2000s, but the subgenre that has dominated the 2010s is deathcore. It started in the late 2000s, but really picked up in this decade. Deathcore takes some of the ideas of metalcore, tears out the melody, and takes all of its metal influences from death metal, rather than the mixed bag approach of metalcore. The guitars in deathcore are tuned down to an insane degree, often resulting in what's known as chugging, which is when they pan mute the top string and it makes a noise that can be best described as a chug. Sometimes the guitars are so down-tuned that you can literally hear the string wobbling from how loose it is. The vocals range from low growls to high shrieks, and while death metal tries to go faster towards the climax of a song, deathcore goes slower into what's known as a breakdown. This was started in metalcore but became utterly fetishized in deathcore. The idea is that if you slow a riff down, it feels heavier in an almost literal sense. Plus, it makes the riffs easier to move to. In terms of notable bands, the best known is probably Suicide Silence, who really cranked up the edginess. Suicide Silence managed to attract an emo fan base, which caused the metal community as a whole to try and distance themselves from deathcore, even though it can hardly be called mainstream. Consequently, this then resulted in a lot of deathcore bands insisting that they aren't deathcore, even though they clearly are. Despite its dodgy reputation, I actually like a bit of deathcore when I'm in the right mood for it. The right mood being angry. Some deathcore bands worth checking out include Thy Art Is Murder, Whitechapel, Job for a Cowboy, Rings of Saturn, Infant Annihilator, whose music videos are juvenile but hilarious, Black Tongue, who play 9 strings for fuck's sake, Signs of the Swarm, whose vocalist sounds like a fucking sink drain, The Acacia Strain, and Bro Job. Another band that was quite important in the early deathcore scene was Bring Me the Horizon. I say was because after the first couple of albums they dropped deathcore for metalcore with electronic elements, and with every subsequent release they have softened their sound and dumbed down their music into inoffensive, easily digestible pop music. Because they started out as a metal band, metal news sites still cover them, but make no mistake, Bring Me the Horizon are not metal anymore. And they don't hide it, they say this themselves. At this point, Bring Me the Horizon just sound like what would happen if Billie Eilish could actually play an instrument.
Move!
The deathcore scene really started to die out in 2017 when Suicide Silence released an album that attempted to use clean vocals, and they were subsequently memed into oblivion by YouTuber Jared Dines. Deathcore can work with clean vocals though. Seriously, just listen to the latest Whitechapel album. Now, you might be thinking that deathcore and metalcore sound similar to djent, and you'd be right. They use the same kind of low tuning on the guitars. The difference is, djent tends to be a lot more technical and musically complex. It also incorporates far more experimental elements and unusual time signatures, whereas deathcore and metalcore are almost always in your standard 4/4 time signature. You could maybe argue that djent is progressive metalcore, but Meshuggah have been around since before metalcore was a thing, so that's why I personally recognise djent as its own separate subgenre, rather than simply being progressive metalcore or progressive deathcore. One other note, the term metalcore can be used to refer to deathcore, but not the other way round. So, while deathcore is metalcore, metalcore is not necessarily deathcore. Metalcore is sometimes used to describe modern metal in general, although when people are using it that way, they'll simply say core. And the mere mention of the word core is enough to send metal elitists into hysterics.
Core? Core? Core!
So those are all the main subgenres explained, but we're still not done. I should also explain what I call modifiers. These are adjectives that get put in front of a subgenre when describing a band's sound, but don't refer to an entirely new subgenre in itself. For example, technical death metal isn't a subgenre, but it's accurate to describe some death metal bands as technical, because their take on death metal is especially complex and difficult to play. So here are the most common modifiers. Blackened means that it takes some influences from black metal. Progressive means that it gets a bit experimental. Melodic is fairly self-explanatory, as is atmospheric and symphonic. Extreme is obviously just a particularly heavy variation of a given subgenre. Some people like to treat extreme metal as its own subgenre, but I think it's far too vague for that. Because by doing it that way, you start lumping Meshuggah, Cattle Decap, and Burzum all together in the one thing, and they aren't similar enough for that to work. So I'm not really on board with that theory. Then of course we have the nationality of the band, which often gets thrown in front of their subgenre when they're being described in album reviews and articles and all that sort of thing. Don't get confused. All it means is that's the band's nationality. No subgenre is exclusive to a given country. Norwegian black metal is just black metal made in Norway. Grind can be added to a subgenre's name to suggest a grindcore influence. For example, I have frequently heard people refer to Cattle Decapitation as a death grind band, meaning they're a mix of death metal and grindcore. Now, death metal and grindcore are already very similar, but deathgrind basically describes bands who frequently utilise the signifying tropes from both subgenres. Core can also be added to the end of a subgenre to suggest a metalcore influence, but be wary when you see this, because unless the core in question is one of the subgenres that I've already described, then this label is probably being used derisively. For example, certain black metal bands like Dark Funeral, who focus less on atmosphere and instead put emphasis on speed and aggression, are often referred to as Norsecore. They are almost exclusively called this by true cult black metal fans who hate them. The implication is that their particular style of black metal is watered down and attempts to be more mainstream. I mean, it really isn't. It really fucking isn't. I guess this is the kind of perspective you'll get if you just never interact with normal people, but yeah, you're not gonna hear Dark Funeral on Capital FM, guys, Jesus Christ. Which is why I take that modifier with a pinch of salt. Now lastly, we come to joke subgenres. These are the ones people refer to ironically, but don't actually recognise as a real musical movement. Most of these are lyrical, as in the gimmick of the subgenre is pretty much entirely defined by what the lyrics are about. Some of these do have more than one band in them, but the only consistency between those bands is the lyrics rather than the actual sound. We have pirate metal, Viking metal, Christian metal, vegan metal, historical metal, Ned Flanders metal, gay deathcore, suicidal depressive black metal, national socialist black metal, and of course in response to that, anti-fascist black metal. But you can also get joke subgenres that have nothing to do with the lyrics, such as crabcore, which is literally just metalcore except they squat like crabs when they play. Seriously. This was a thing.
I like crabcore.
What the hell's crab whore? Sounds like a bad porno.
It's when you get really down low and you strum a guitar at dick level, like this.
Bro metal refers to very mainstream metal bands that a stereotypical insecure tough guy would listen to. None of the bands that we categorise as bro metal would call themselves that because it's a derisive joke subgenre. The target audience of bro metal tends to be guys in their 20s and 30s who drive pickup trucks, drink more Monster Energy than water, and won't wear anything that doesn't have the fucking Punisher logo on it. Every single bro metal song is either about getting in fights, being a proud American, or licking the boots of the military. So basically Godsmack, Five Finger Death Punch, and any other band that's basically just a heavier Nickelback. And lastly, there's kawaii metal, which fuses metal and J-pop into a terrifying abomination that must be purged with fire. You might have heard of the band Baby Metal, which has 3 young girls singing cutesy Japanese lyrics over metal riffs. Baby Metal were at best mildly amusing for the first 3 minutes, but they have more than overstayed their welcome, and their meme status has sabotaged every poll about the best metal albums and songs in which it's featured. Oh, at last, I have finally finished explaining all this. Once again, I would like to emphasise that this is my system of labelling and that other people's definitions of these subgenres may differ greatly from my own. This has been how I understand the subgenres, and I hope that this has helped you understand the differences between them. I tried to cover everything, but if I missed any out or you want to hear about one in more detail, let me know and I'll make a follow-up. Every time I think I know everything there is to know about metal, it finds a way to surprise me. After all this, if you hear someone say that all metal sounds the same, you have my express permission to cave their face in.
In a video game.
I'm Perg, and I need a nap.